In June of 2014, a 31-year-old woman named Sophie Simmons was sitting in a hospital bed in Florida with her hands on her knees, bracing herself against waves of pain. She had gone into labor a little while earlier, and the contractions were only getting more intense. But despite that, she didn't seem to be getting any closer to actually delivering her baby. Even her husband Evan seemed to feel the same way. She hadn't seen him this nervous in years. Sophie's doctor was by her side, monitoring her condition. He called a nurse over, and they started talking in low voices to each other. Sophie couldn't hear what they were saying, but from their body language, it didn't seem good. Once they were done talking, the doctor turned to Sophie and told her there was going to be a change of plan. The doctor told her that attempting to deliver her baby vaginally was too risky. She needed an emergency C-section right now. Before Sophie could even process this news, a pair of nurses started unplugging her from all the monitors and then began wheeling her bed down the hall. As soon as she was in the operating room, a doctor administered a local anesthetic to numb her lower body, and then a nurse set up a curtain to block Sophie's view of the operation. Sophie tried to stay calm, but she had not mentally prepared for emergency surgery. Her mind raced with worries and worst-case scenarios. The fear that something might happen to her baby horrified her. A moment later, the drugs set in, and Sophie could no longer feel her legs. After what felt like an eternity, or maybe just a moment, she heard a small, squeaky cry. It was the voice of her baby, a little girl, and tears immediately streamed down Sophie's cheeks. While the nurses cleaned the baby up, the doctor finished the final part of the operation, which was to remove the placenta, the organ that had provided Sophie's daughter oxygen and nutrients while in the womb. Now that Sophie's baby was born, it effectively needed to be delivered as well. The doctor delicately eased the placenta away from the wall of Sophie's uterus, handed it to a nurse, and then stitched up the incision. Once he was done, a nurse placed Sophie's daughter in her arms, and right away, Sophie's heart just melted. She and her husband already had a name picked out for the baby, Lola. She couldn't believe how perfect and beautiful Lola was. Evan wrapped his arm around his wife, and they gazed together at their daughter. Eventually, a nurse came by and swaddled Lola in a blanket, then carried her over to the nursery to take some measurements. While this was going on, Sophie was able to finally close her eyes and float away in a haze of exhaustion. A half hour later, the doctor gently woke Sophie up and told her there were a few issues he wanted to discuss. First, while delivering the baby, the doctor had noticed that the amniotic fluid inside of Sophie's uterus wasn't clear like it should have been. Instead, it had a greenish hue to it from the baby's fecal matter called meconium. The doctor explained that that usually happens when the baby has some kind of distress before they're born, and it can be dangerous to the baby if meconium gets into their lungs. Thankfully, though, it did not appear like Lola had ingested any meconium. Lola's fetal distress likely occurred during Sophie's labor when the baby couldn't get out. Also, the baby's measurements showed that her head was bigger than Sophie's pelvis, so vaginal delivery was always going to be impossible. However, the doctor continued, Lola had been injured during the attempted vaginal birth. The baby's hip had been displaced. The doctor promised it was nothing to worry about, but in a few weeks, once Lola was big enough, she would need to wear a corrective brace for just a little while. The doctor said a nurse would stop by later to explain when and how to use it. After the doctor left, Sophie leaned back on her bed and closed her eyes. Lola's birth had been a roller coaster. Good news one minute, bad the next. Sophie just felt grateful that her daughter was safe and healthy, despite all the complications. A few hours later, Sophie woke up from a long nap inside of the maternity ward. She knew her body had just been through a very exhausting ordeal, but even so, something felt off. She was groggy, sluggish, and deeply dehydrated. Evan went out and got a bottle of water and gave it to her. He told her that she did look flushed, maybe even feverish. And then after he felt her forehead and saw that she was warm, Evan decided to go find a nurse. A few minutes later, Evan was back, accompanied by one of the nurses who had attended Sophie's birth. She took Sophie's temperature and said that it was a bit higher than normal. She told her it was likely related to something they had just found in their latest lab tests. The test showed that Sophie's placenta had contained a serious bacterial infection. They had not identified the source of it yet, but it was possible that it had been caused by the meconium in Sophie's amniotic fluid. For now, the nurse said that the doctor had prescribed antibiotics to reduce her fever. And, to be on the safe side, he had also prescribed baby Lola some antibiotics as well, to combat any lingering effects of the contamination in the amniotic fluid. Before leaving, the nurse urged Sophie not to worry. Her baby was healthy, and she was too. Even the smoothest birth is still a huge strain on the body, and so it was perfectly normal to feel out of sorts afterwards. It would pass soon, and before long, Sophie, her husband, and little Lola would be home enjoying being a new little family. But 2 days later, Sophie had gone home, but she was not happy. She was shivering and huddled on a love seat in Lola's nursery while her baby napped. Despite the nurse's promises, Sophie had not gotten better. She was still feverish, and her body felt even more sluggish. She tried to be patient and let her body recover at its own pace, but it felt like it was taking too long. She pulled a second blanket over her and tried to rest. A couple hours later, Evan came home from work and walked right into the nursery. He hugged Sophie and then stepped back with a worried expression. It was clear she was not doing well. Evan went to the bathroom and got a thermometer, and he took Sophie's temperature. It was 101. He reminded Sophie that the hospital had told them to call if Sophie's fever didn't go away soon, and so it felt like it was time to let them know. Sophie agreed, and she grabbed her phone. Her call was transferred to an obstetrician, who told her not to worry. She probably just needed a different antibiotic than the one she was taking. The doctor told her she would change Sophie's prescription right now, and then told her to call back if her symptoms still did not improve. A week later, Sophie lay curled up on the couch while Evan bottle-fed Lola in the nursery. Every day since Sophie had come home from the hospital had been a slog, but lately she had been feeling absolutely terrible. Chills, aches, cramps, it was the worst. The new antibiotics had not worked any better than the first ones. Between the sleep deprivation from taking care of a newborn and the sweaty delirium from her fever, Sophie felt like she was losing her mind. Sophie had called her obstetrics practice nearly every other day and gone in for multiple appointments. But each time she was just given a different explanation for why her symptoms kept lingering. And all the medical professionals reassured her that there was still no need to worry. And so eventually, Sophie started to get the impression that what was really going on here was no one in her health network had any idea what was actually going on with her. Later that morning, when Lola went down for a nap, Evan came and joined Sophie on the couch. She managed to sit up so they could have a serious talk. Sophie admitted that she was starting to worry that something might really be wrong with her. Evan suggested she call her obstetrician directly, since he was the one who was actually there when Lola was born. He was the one who actually diagnosed her birth complications, so maybe he would have different advice for Sophie's recovery. Sophie called and left a message, and within an hour, Sophie's doctor called back. After she described all of her symptoms in detail, his response scared her. He told her to come to the hospital right now. Hours later, Sophie was on her back inside of the sleek white tube of a CT scanner. She listened while the machine hummed and whirred, using x-rays to map a detailed image of the inside of her body. When the machine finally wrapped up, the scanning bed Sophie was on gently slid out, and right away Sophie sat up, feeling suddenly anxious that she might have to be away from her daughter Lola for a whole night. Her friends, who were mothers, had told her how important that first month was for bonding with the baby. Sophie hoped her doctor could quickly figure out what was wrong with her so she could get back home. A little while later, her doctor entered and told her that the CT scans had found something. He now knew what was causing her abdominal pains. There was an abscess on the lower right side of her torso. Abscesses are small pockets of pus that can form while the immune system fights off an infection. The doctor theorized that Sophie's abscess very likely took root during her pregnancy, possibly due to the contamination of the amniotic fluid. Either way, Sophie's doctor said he was going to schedule a procedure to drain the pus from her abscess. Once that was done, Sophie's symptoms should clear up quickly. The following morning, Sophie was laying in a hospital room recovering from her procedure. Her head still felt sort of cloudy from the anesthetic, but when her doctor walked in to check on her, she did her best to pay attention. He told her the surgery had gone well. Her abscess was now fully drained of the infected fluid, which meant her symptoms should fade soon. However, the doctor did have one concern. The lab had analyzed the pus from her abscess and discovered that it contained a type of strep bacteria that can be dangerous for newborns, potentially causing blood or lung infections. The doctor seemed surprised by it. All pregnant women are supposed to be screened for strep late in their pregnancy and given antibiotics to kill it if they test positive. The doctor asked Sophie if she remembered being tested for strep. Sophie said she genuinely couldn't remember whether she'd been screened for strep or not, but she wasn't sure if maybe she was just still foggy from the anesthesia. The doctor told her that was fine. He would check the hospital's records to try to verify himself. In the meantime, he advised Sophie to go home, get as much rest as possible, and spend some quality time with her baby. Just 1 week later, Sophie was back at the hospital. Following the abscess surgery, Sophie's abdominal pains never went away. In fact, the symptoms just got worse. Now she was suffering these frightening moments where she could barely breathe. Even just walking around the house made her gasp for air, like she was hyperventilating. It made her so dizzy she thought she might faint, and she had developed this really dark fear that she might pass out while holding Lola and would harm her. One afternoon, she was feeling so weak and so feverish that she decided to take her own temperature. And the number she read was shocking, 103. For an adult, that was an extremely high fever. Sophie immediately called her doctor, who told her to get back to the hospital right away. He wanted to run another CT scan. After spending another half hour inside the white tube of the CT scanner, Sophie met with her doctor in his office. He was blunt with her. Things had gotten worse. The latest scan showed that now, Sophie's entire abdomen was filled with fluid. This indicated that her body was fighting off a much more severe infection than doctors had previously believed. But at this point, Sophie wasn't even surprised. Bad news seemed like the only news she ever received ever since her daughter was born. The doctor recommended that Sophie undergo a surgical procedure called a washout to drain all the fluid from inside of her abdomen. He felt confident that this would help her body fight off the infection and finally lead to a full recovery. The only downside was that it would require reopening the C-section incision across her belly, so she would take longer to heal. Sophie felt exhausted and frustrated, but it didn't seem like there was really any other alternative here, so she agreed to yet another surgery. Several hours later, Sophie was laying in a recovery room, feeling groggy from the operation. Evan had told her he would bring Lola by the hospital later for a visit. Sophie missed her baby terribly and just wanted to hold her again. A few minutes later, the door opened and it was her doctor, and he pulled up a chair by her bed. He told her that the washout procedure had been a success. All the fluid in her abdomen had been drained. The only sort of unexpected development during the surgery was that the doctor had actually decided to remove Sophie's appendix. Appendixes can become inflamed and then infected and have to be removed. And based on all the issues Sophie was having with this infection and the fluid buildup inside of her abdomen, the doctors decided it made sense to sort of save her from a future surgery and just get rid of the appendix now. Sophie didn't really know how to feel about this, but she was too exhausted to feel one way or another. She just nodded and slumped back into the pillows. All Sophie could think about was going home to her daughter. Sophie spent the next 2 days recovering in the hospital's intensive care unit, being treated with antibiotics and an IV drip of fluids and vitamins. And although her fever and abdominal pain never entirely went away, they were noticeably milder. Her second morning in the hospital following the procedure, Sophie's doctor came to check on her and also brought news. The hospital had been reviewing her case and had finally completed a full diagnosis of her condition. Sophie's illness began with her C-section. Her incision had become infected, which then spread into the lining of her abdomen, and the infection eventually caused her whole abdomen to fill with pus, which triggered a condition called sepsis. This is a potentially fatal condition caused by the immune system overreacting to an infection. In Sophie's case, the sepsis advanced to the point that it spread throughout most of her body, which is why her symptoms had become so severe. The good news was that the hospital had caught it in time. It could have been a whole lot worse, as sepsis is actually one of the leading causes of maternal death. But now, at last, the doctor told her that her health complications should be over. He had already submitted the paperwork for Sophie to be discharged from the hospital the following day, and he promised her that this time she'd be going home for good. That night, as Sophie lay in her hospital bed looking out the window at the stars, she felt a wave of gratitude. The past few weeks had been awful, some of the scariest moments of her whole life. She couldn't wait to simply put it in the past and focus on the future. Over the next 8 years, Sophie's life changed radically, for better and also for worse. She and Evan, unfortunately, got divorced. But Sophie also moved to Washington, D.C. for a job that she loved. And Lola grew up into the smart, confident young girl who loved animals. So one afternoon in the fall of 2022, Sophie and Lola stepped off a metro train at the National Mall with plans to spend the day at the National Zoo. Lola was buzzing with excitement. Overall, their life together in D.C. had been great. However, Sophie's main struggle remained her health. She had never fully recovered since her post-pregnancy issues years ago. She still suffered from mysterious abdominal pains and low-level fevers that sometimes lasted for weeks. The symptoms shifted occasionally, but Sophie always felt a bit off. For a while, Sophie attributed her constant illnesses to Lola tracking home sickness from other kids. Daycare through kindergarten was like being in a full-time germ incubator, and Lola was constantly getting sick. But another part of Sophie wondered if maybe her health issues might have something to do with all the antibiotics she had taken after Lola was born. Maybe all the drugs had permanently weakened her immune system. And in addition to these long-standing symptoms from when her daughter was born, Sophie had also developed gastrointestinal issues. A while back, Sophie had suffered from extreme bouts of diarrhea and also constipation, to the point where she visited a specialist who diagnosed her as having irritable bowel syndrome. Then, just as she was coming to terms with that, Sophie began having new gynecological issues. First, a series of painful yeast infections, followed by a number of complicated urinary tract infections. It felt like she was constantly visiting a different doctor and trying out a new treatment. But despite all of her health issues, Sophie's career as an attorney was really taking off. The firm in D.C. that had hired her was large and prestigious, and she felt appreciated by her coworkers. But on this particular fall day, she was glad to just be enjoying some time away from work with her daughter. After a few hours at the zoo, Sophie was standing with Lola watching the world-famous pandas when she felt a familiar burning sensation, and she figured she might be getting one of her yeast infections again. She made a mental note to stop at the pharmacy on the way home and pick up some over-the-counter meds for it. However, a few days later, it had only gotten worse. For some reason, her usual medication was having no effect. Sophie booked an appointment with her primary care doctor, but after running some tests, he didn't think Sophie had a yeast infection at all. He suggested she visit her OBGYN instead. Sophie's previous OBGYN had relocated, so it took some time for Sophie to find a new one. But after the holidays, in March of 2023, Sophie finally visited with her new OBGYN, Dr. Arnold Culver. But despite going to Dr. Culver several times that spring, he was unable to determine what was causing Sophie's symptoms. However, he was pretty sure they weren't connected to Sophie's many past health issues. But then, almost magically, Sophie's pain just went away. Sophie was so grateful to feel better and was so tired of having to deal with this nonsense. So instead of questioning why she was better, she simply moved on. Her career was keeping her busy, and Lola's school and social schedule was packed, and so trying to make sense of her mystery infection was low on Sophie's list of priorities. Then, 3 months later, in the middle of June 2023, Sophie received a life-changing opportunity. The President of the United States had nominated her to serve as general counsel of an entire federal agency. The position would be a dream job, and Sophie was deeply honored to just be considered. But in order to be confirmed for that position, she would first have to undergo a very stressful Senate hearing in November. For the rest of the summer and into the fall, Sophie prepared relentlessly. She was determined to land this job and improve her and Lola's life. But all the pressure and the long hours really began to take their toll. Before long, Sophie's old symptoms flared up: weakness, fever, abdominal pains. One night, her symptoms got so bad, Sophie had to spend a night at the hospital. But she bounced back as best as she could and just kept trying to push through it. Sophie's entire focus was the Senate subcommittee hearing, and she was determined to pass it with flying colors. Months later, on a crisp November afternoon, Sophie practically skipped down the steps of the United States Capitol building. She had just left a Senate hearing room after a multi-hour interview, and all her preparation had paid off. Sophie had felt confident and articulate while defending her nomination, and so now there was nothing for her to do but wait and let the Senate decide. Back at home, later that afternoon, Sophie was helping Lola with her homework when she noticed a dull throb in her stomach. At first, the pain was fairly mild, but by dinner, it had grown deep and forceful. After putting Lola to bed, Sophie asked her neighbor to keep an eye on her daughter, and then she drove herself to an urgent care center. At the clinic, Sophie was prescribed antibiotics and then sent home. But in the morning, the pain in her abdomen was worse than ever, and her belly also looked swollen. Sophie could barely make it to the car without her daughter helping her walk. After dropping Lola off at school, Sophie drove right back to that clinic. This time, the doctor at the clinic drew blood and had the lab run a wide range of tests on it. An hour or two later, he came back to her with the results. He told Sophie that her white blood cell count was high, which indicated her immune system was fighting off an infection of some kind. But he added that a second issue was potentially more serious. They had detected fluid in Sophie's fallopian tubes. The doctor recommended that Sophie head for the hospital to address these issues because the urgent care clinic was not equipped for the treatments she would most likely need. But by midday, when the clinic was finalizing Sophie's transfer to a nearby hospital, her symptoms abruptly disappeared. Despite that, Sophie's doctor still recommended that she stay for a day or two at the hospital just to be safe. Sophie agreed and arranged to have Lola spend a couple of nights with a classmate. 48 hours later, Sophie woke up feeling better than she had in a long time. Her abdominal pains were gone, and her stomach had shrunk back to its normal size. Sophie was thrilled, but before she left the hospital, the doctor gave her a warning. Whatever had caused her pain and swelling was clearly still inside of her. Nothing had been treated, and so until the root cause of her symptoms was identified and fixed, the doctor thought they would return sooner or later. Sophie knew the doctor was right. She had been coping with her mystery pains for nearly a decade, and so far, no surgery or medication had cured them. She needed to face this head-on, or it would remain a part of her life forever. The following week, Sophie made an appointment with her OB-GYN, Dr. Culver. Sitting in his office, they reviewed her medical history. Sophie told him that she didn't want to wait for another flare-up. She wanted to solve her health issues now, once and for all. Antibiotics had been helpful off and on, but she had experienced so many different infections over the years that there was no reason to think it wouldn't just keep happening. Dr. Culver agreed with her. However, given all the tests and scans that Sophie had done at this point, in his opinion, the last option left was exploratory surgery. Only by looking directly at her internal organs would a doctor be able to identify and treat whatever was causing her recurring abdominal pain. Sophie did not like the idea of yet another surgery, but at this point, she had lived in the shadow of her health problems for so long that she felt like she just didn't have a choice here. She could either take this risk or continue to suffer for the rest of her life with this condition that basically no one understood. And she was just so tired of suffering. So, Sophie told Dr. Culver to book the surgery. It was time to take her life back. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 29, 2023, Dr. Culver stood above Sophie in the operating room. The exploratory surgery had been going on for about an hour, and so far, there had been no major revelations. The room was nearly silent, despite the small group clustered around Dr. Culver. He had invited some different medical experts to attend the operation in case he did encounter something unusual. And as Dr. Culver probed the inside of Sophie's abdomen, something caught his eye. At first, he didn't recognize it, but as he looked closer, he gradually realized what it was. And he couldn't believe his eyes. Dr. Culver pointed it out to his colleagues, and they were all equally astonished. Finally, right before their eyes, was the source of Sophie's affliction. What Dr. Culver had discovered was a piece of Sophie's appendix. The appendix that supposedly had been fully removed in 2014. Somehow, the doctor who performed that surgery had missed a small section of it. Over the 7 years since that operation, this finger-shaped piece of her appendix had grafted itself to Sophie's right ovary. That caused major problems because the appendix is also attached to the large intestine. That meant that Sophie's leftover appendix was dumping waste, including liquefied fecal matter, directly into her ovary. And from there, the waste flowed straight into Sophie's fallopian tubes. This is why Sophie never stopped getting sick. But Dr. Culver's discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Why had Sophie's doctor even performed that appendectomy if it wasn't causing her health issues at the time? And how could any surgeon have failed to see that there was still a piece of the appendix sitting in Sophie's body? And why had none of the countless health professionals who had cared for Sophie over the years ever detected the stray section of organ during one of Sophie's many CT scans? Dr. Culver would never know, but Sophie was just lucky that he found it when he did. 10 months after Dr. Culver removed the piece of leftover appendix, Sophie was given a clean bill of health, for real. Her abdominal pain and other symptoms never returned. Despite all the suffering she endured, it does not appear like Sophie decided to take any legal action against any of her doctors. It appears she decided to turn her attention to the future instead. On the evening of November 27, 1998, 25-year-old Corey Parker pulled a pie out of the oven in the kitchen of her first-floor apartment in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. She put the pie down on the counter near the open kitchen window to help it cool. This pie was one of a few that Corey had made in preparation for Thanksgiving, which was the following day. Corey had always loved Thanksgiving, but she was really looking forward to the holiday this year. A few months earlier, she had moved from Rochester, New York to Jacksonville Beach, so this was the first time she'd lived on her own, and the first time she was going to celebrate what she called Friendsgiving. Corey and a bunch of others who weren't spending the holiday with family were all making different Thanksgiving foods and getting together at a friend's house on the holiday. Corey cleaned up the small mess she'd made while baking all day, she walked through the apartment to the bathroom, and she took a shower. After her shower, Corey did her makeup and her hair, and then went to her bedroom closet. She scanned the clothes that were hanging up, and she grabbed a pair of black pants and a blue velvet tank top. Then she picked up her favorite pair of black high heels, stepped into her room, and got dressed. She walked through the apartment, grabbed her keys off the coffee table, and headed outside. Corey locked the door behind her, and then walked down a sidewalk that led past several small apartment buildings just like hers. Each of the buildings looked like an old house that had a few apartments in it. Corey loved this spot in the small beach town where she lived, because this was the first place where she felt like she was truly independent. But she also loved it because the apartments close to hers were home to a lot of other young people. And tonight, Corey saw a bunch of them hanging out outside. She saw people drinking beer and smoking in front of their apartments. Her teenage neighbor from the building behind hers was listening to music on a second-floor balcony, and others were walking to their cars to go out for the night. Corey could also see people who had spent the day drinking at the nearby beach, laughing and stumbling down the street that ran in front of the apartment buildings. The noise and near-constant activity around the apartments drove some people crazy, but Corey liked it when there were a lot of people around. She thought it was fun, but it also made her feel safe to know that she was not out there by herself at night. Because recently, some of the women who lived nearby had caught a peeping Tom watching them through their windows. None of the women had gotten a really good look at him, but they thought he looked like a middle-aged man, and that there was a good chance he lived in one of the apartments. But tonight, there were plenty of people out, so Corey didn't worry about some strange man creeping around the apartments trying to spy on young women. Corey stepped off the sidewalk and crossed a small patch of grass to where her car was parked on the street. She got in, started the car, cranked up her stereo, and sped off down the street. She drove for a few blocks and pulled onto a road that ran alongside the beach and was lined with bars and restaurants. This was the town's main drag, and it was already packed with cars and people. Jacksonville Beach was a resort town that hosted a lot of tourists who came to spend time at the beach and to enjoy themselves at all these touristy bars and restaurants down by the water. Corey worked as a waitress at one of those kinds of restaurants, and she enjoyed it. It was exciting getting to meet and talk to people from all over the place, but when Corey and her friends went out, they preferred to go to places where the locals hung out. So Corey pulled off the main drag onto a side street, and a couple of minutes later, she saw the big lit-up sign for her favorite bar and lounge called The Ritz. Corey pulled into the Ritz parking lot, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and then got out of her car. As she walked across the parking lot, she could already hear the live music blaring inside. Corey showed her ID to the bouncer at the door, and then she stepped inside the club. And as soon as she did, it was almost like the whole place started moving in slow motion or something. Because when Corey walked inside, almost everybody turned to look at her. Corey was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and in her heels, she stood well over 6 feet tall. She was beautiful with long brown hair, and a lot of people who met her, especially when she was dressed up for a night out, just assumed she was a model or an actress. Corey didn't mind the attention, but recently she'd started dating a new guy and it was getting pretty serious. So she wasn't at the club to meet anyone new. She was there to spend time with one of her best friends and just to have a good time. Just then, Corey heard a loud scream over the music coming from somewhere behind her. She turned and her face lit up. One of Corey's best friends, Tiffany Zienta, ran over, wrapped her arms around Corey's waist, and gave her a big hug. Then the two women made their way to the bar and ordered some drinks. And while they waited, they talked about their plans for Thanksgiving. And Corey said how excited she was for Friendsgiving. Tiffany said she was a bit jealous. She was spending the holiday with her parents, which was okay, but spending time with Corey and other people their age sounded way more fun. The bartender came over and handed Corey and Tiffany their drinks. The two women raised their glasses, downed the drinks, and cheered on the band playing. At 1:30 a.m. on November 28th, so a few hours after Corey had arrived at the Ritz, she got into her car and started driving home. She knew she had a big day ahead of her, so she had kept her drinking to a minimum. That's why she had passed when Tiffany had asked her to stay out a bit later and go bar hopping with them before heading home for the night. Tiffany was bummed, but Corey knew she did not want to be completely exhausted for Thanksgiving. Corey drove down the street in front of her building, parked her car, and stepped outside. She walked down the sidewalk to her apartment, and as she did, she felt herself tense up a bit. It was a lot quieter than it had been when she left, and nobody else seemed to be around. Corey approached her apartment, and she saw a few people out on their balconies in the buildings next to hers and behind hers, and this made her relax a bit. She unlocked her front door, went inside, and locked the door behind her. Then she dropped her keys on the coffee table and went to her bedroom. She slipped off her heels and tossed the shoes and her purse onto the floor, and then she got undressed, climbed into bed, and fell asleep pretty quickly. But just a little later, Corey woke up, startled. It was dark and she was disoriented, but she thought she heard someone breathing. At 11 a.m. on November 29th, so the day after Thanksgiving, a cook at a Jacksonville Beach restaurant prepped his station in the kitchen, getting ready for the lunchtime rush. The cook glanced at his watch and stopped what he was doing. He walked out of the kitchen and scanned the restaurant floor, and he got worried when he didn't see Corey. The cook and Corey not only worked together, but they were also friends, and so they would let each other know if they were going to miss a shift. So the cook quickly met with some of the waiters and other kitchen staff to see if any of them had seen or heard from Corey this morning, but none of them had. And one of the waitresses said she was really concerned because she had called Corey the day before when she had heard from a mutual friend that Corey had not shown up for Friendsgiving. The restaurant manager came over and he said he was worried too. He'd tried calling Corey a couple of times this morning and hadn't heard back, and it was not like her to just blow off a shift without calling in. The manager asked the cook if he knew where Corey lived. The cook said he did, so the manager asked him to go by Corey's place to check on her and make sure she was okay. The cook took off his apron and then walked out to his car and sped out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, he arrived at Corey's apartment. He went up to the front door and knocked, but nobody answered. He knocked again, but it didn't sound like anybody was inside the apartment. And so the cook walked around the apartment to the back, and he found Corey's bedroom window. He looked inside, and he could see part of Corey's room through a small opening in the blinds. He thought he saw Corey, or at least her legs, lying in her bed. He knocked on the glass and waited, but he didn't see any movement inside. So he pressed his face right up against the window to get a better look, and immediately he felt his heart start to race. He turned away from the window and ran as fast as he could back to his car and sped back to the restaurant. The cook ran inside, and the manager and the other staff members could tell something was obviously wrong, but the cook didn't even say a word. Instead, he ran to the front counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, 2 Jacksonville Beach police officers arrived at Corey's apartment. The call they had gotten from dispatch had been kind of vague, because the young man who had called 911 said he really hadn't seen much. A
Apparently, he'd looked through a small opening in the window blinds and he thought he saw his friend laying in bed. And he thought he saw blood on her foot. So the officers didn't really know if they were dealing with a potential accident, a violent crime, or if the caller had just panicked and dialed 911 without really even seeing anything. And so the officers walked up to Corey's front door and they knocked, but nobody answered. One of them tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So they walked around the side of the apartment and they saw that the kitchen window was open. One of the officers told his partner to wait right there by the side of the house, and he said he would check out the apartment. Then he put on a pair of gloves, opened up the window a bit more, and then climbed through the opening into the kitchen. Once inside the apartment, the officer called out and introduced himself as a police officer in case anyone was home. But nobody responded. It was totally silent. And so he began looking around the kitchen, but there was nothing there that looked strange. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle, and then also he checked the front room of the apartment, and there also was nothing there. And so he walked to the back of the apartment where Corey's bedroom was. The officer got to the bedroom door, and he saw it was slightly cracked open. Before opening it, he called out one more time, not wanting to frighten anybody if they were sleeping in the room, but there still wasn't any response. And so the officer opened the bedroom door, looked into the room, and was absolutely horrified by what he found. Minutes later, detectives Katie Kingston and Billy Carlisle arrived at Corey's apartment. They were followed by several uniformed police officers and a forensics team. Kingston and Carlisle ducked under the crime scene tape that had been strung up across Corey's front door. They walked inside and quickly found their way to the bedroom. The detectives stepped into the room, and immediately they felt just as shocked as the officer who had first arrived on scene. A young woman lay in bed, propped up against the headboard. She was completely naked, and her whole body was covered in blood. And there was so much blood spatter on the wall behind the bed that it looked like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint against the wall. As Detective Kingston walked closer to the bed, she could barely wrap her mind around what she was looking at. This poor young woman had sustained an unthinkable number of stab wounds. Then Kingston noticed something laying on the bed next to Corey. Now at first, it just looked like another bloodstain, but Kingston leaned down and saw that it was actually a pair of bloody women's underwear. Kingston heard her name, and she turned to see Carlisle crouched over, looking at something on the floor near the bed. She went over to him, and she saw he had found a gold cigarette lighter. The detectives walked the rest of the room, but other than the lighter and the underwear, nothing really jumped out at them. They saw some clothes and shoes on the floor, but they were not drenched in blood like the underwear. The detectives also found a purse in the bedroom with a driver's license inside, and so they were able to officially identify the victim as Corey Parker. Kingston and Carlisle stepped aside and let a couple of forensics officers get to work in the bedroom. The forensics officers were able to take multiple blood samples, but the investigators realized there was a chance that all this blood was the victims, not the killers. Then one of the forensics officers looked more closely at Corey's body, and he said the medical examiner would have to weigh in, but he didn't see any signs of sexual assault. And so Kingston and Carlisle theorized that, maybe Corey had just gone to bed naked, or maybe the killer had stripped off her underwear either during the attack or afterwards for some unknown reason. The forensics officer motioned for the two detectives to look, and when they leaned down, they saw a strand of hair on Corey's underwear, and it definitely did not match Corey's. And so the detectives believed that, given the location of this piece of hair on her underwear, and the insane level of violence inflicted on Corey, meant they were most likely looking for a current or former intimate partner. Throughout the afternoon, the investigative team searched the apartment and the surrounding area, and the detectives caught something that the first officers on the scene had missed. There were drops of blood on the kitchen counter and on the outside kitchen windowsill. The officers that arrived first had told Kingston and Carlisle that the kitchen window had been open when they got there. That's how they got inside. And so the detectives imagined that this is where the killer must have entered and exited the apartment. And so they hoped that the blood on the counter and the windowsill belonged to the killer. The forensics team took blood samples from both of those spots and prepped them to be sent to the lab along with the blood samples from the bedroom and the strand of hair they'd found on the underwear. In 1998, DNA testing was starting to evolve, but the process was still slow, and it was not always as effective as it is today. So Kingston and Carlisle knew they could be waiting a while for any test results, and that those results might not tell them anything. In the meantime, they wanted to speak to people who might have seen something that night or who knew Corey well. That afternoon, the detectives canvassed the apartment buildings nearby, and several people who had been on their balconies or in front of their apartments thought they had seen Corey leaving her apartment the night before Thanksgiving. And none of them had seen or heard anything strange in that area over the past 2 days. One neighbor also said she had met Corey's new boyfriend, and she provided enough information that an officer back at the station was able to quickly track him down. And it turned out the boyfriend was away visiting his family for Thanksgiving, and the officer was able to find proof that he had taken a flight days before Corey was killed, so detectives Carlisle and Kingston did not consider the boyfriend a prime suspect. But Corey could have been seeing someone else, or she could have had ex-lovers who were jealous about her new relationship. So, after getting confirmation about the boyfriend's alibi, Kingston and Carlisle got in their car and drove a few blocks away to the restaurant where Corey had worked, hoping one of her coworkers might have additional information about Corey's personal life. They walked in, and the whole place felt like something heavy was hanging over it. The staff were going about their jobs, but it was obvious they were all waiting for news on their friend, Corey. Kingston and Carlisle pulled the manager into the kitchen, and the manager quickly waved over the cook who had called 911. Then the detectives told them that Corey had unfortunately been found dead inside of her apartment. The cook immediately started crying, and the manager closed his eyes and tried to fight back tears. Kingston told them the police would need to talk to everybody at the restaurant who knew Corey, but for now, they wanted to know if there was somebody working there who might have had an intimate relationship with Corey, a boyfriend or even a casual fling. The manager and the cook looked at each other like they were thinking the same thing. The cook said Corey was not actively seeing anybody from the restaurant, but there was a dishwasher who worked there named Eric Ely who wished he had a relationship with Corey. Detective Carlisle asked if he meant that this guy Eric had a crush on Corey, but the cook just shook his head and told the detectives that Eric did not just have a crush on Corey. He was completely obsessed with her. The following day, detectives Kingston and Carlisle sat in an interview room waiting for the dishwasher, Eric Ely, to arrive. Eric had not been at the restaurant the previous day when the detectives were there, but they had spoken to several other staff members about him, and almost all of the women they spoke to at the restaurant said the same thing. Eric was a total creep, and he harassed Corey way more than he harassed anybody else. An officer led Eric into the interview room, and he took a seat across from the detectives. Eric was in his 20s, he had long light brown hair, and as he sat down, he smiled at the detectives. Eric already knew that Corey had been killed, and so Kingston didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She wanted to press Eric right from the start. She leaned across the table and asked Eric point blank if it was true that he was obsessed with Corey. Eric smiled a bit wider and said maybe he was a little obsessed, but Kingston immediately went after him. She said police knew he was more than just a little obsessed. They knew that he had asked Corey on multiple occasions to spend Thanksgiving alone with him, and that even after she turned him down every time, Eric had made a huge Thanksgiving feast and then planned to try to guilt her into coming to his apartment. The smile on Eric's face disappeared. He looked at Kingston and admitted that he was completely obsessed with Corey. But he said he just wanted to spend time with her. He would never hurt her. But then Eric said something that took the detectives by complete surprise. He asked them how Corey was killed. Without missing a beat, Carlisle asked Eric how he thought Corey might have been killed. And Eric immediately got this look on his face like he was having a daydream or something, and then he said he thought the killer probably attacked Corey while she was tired or sleeping and stabbed her. The detectives both looked stunned. Eric had just described, at least in a general way, how Corey had actually been murdered. So Kingston said it sounded like Eric knew a lot about the murder. And what Eric said next stunned the detectives even more. Eric smiled again and told them that maybe he knew how the killer did it because he had fantasized about doing the same things. Kingston asked in a calm voice what kind of fantasies Eric had, and Eric said sometimes he fantasized about raping and murdering women. But before the detectives could even react, Eric said those were just fantasies. He never acted on them, and he never hurt Corey. Kingston and Carlisle talked to Eric for a while longer, and then they ended the interview. They told him he could go, but they made it clear he should not leave town. An officer came in and escorted Eric out of the interview room, and for a second, Kingston and Carlisle just sat there without talking. Neither of them had ever had an interview go like this. They'd never seen anyone discuss their secret desire to rape and kill so easily, especially when they were claiming they didn't do anything. There was no question in their minds that Eric was their best lead by far, but they also knew that they couldn't arrest him just because he had dark and violent thoughts. So they just hoped when the DNA results came in, they would have a clearer idea if Eric was the killer. But in the meantime, they wanted to get a better idea of Corey's last few hours alive. So they talked to some of her friends and eventually tracked down Tiffany Zienta, Corey's friend who had been at the Ritz with her on the night before Thanksgiving, and as far as police knew, was the last person to see Corey alive. In the week following Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat down with Tiffany in the same interview room where they had met with Eric. But the situation was a lot more relaxed, and the detectives told Tiffany they were just trying to get a better picture of Corey's movements on the night before Thanksgiving. Tiffany told them she had met Corey at the club and said they went there together a lot. And then, without any prompting, Tiffany started talking about how beautiful Corey was and what an amazing person she was, and how being around her was just different than being around other people. The detective smiled, nodded, and listened, but both of them thought the same thing. It was completely normal for someone to talk about how great and how pretty one of their friends was, but something in the way Tiffany spoke about Corey felt different than that. So when Tiffany stopped talking, Kingston asked if she and Corey had been more than just friends. Did they ever have an intimate relationship? But Tiffany shook her head and almost laughed. She said no, she and Corey were just really good friends, they had a lot in common, and they loved hanging out together. Then Kingston asked when Tiffany had last seen Corey. At this, Tiffany lowered her head, and it was clear she was starting to cry. She said they left the club sometime around 1:30 a.m., and she asked Corey to go have some late-night drinks with her and a few other friends, but Corey had said she just wanted to go home. Tiffany said she called Corey around 2:15 a.m. just to make sure she had gotten home safely, but nobody answered. Tiffany figured Corey had already gone to bed, and so that's why she didn't try calling back again. The detectives thanked Tiffany for coming in and told her they would follow up with her soon. Tiffany said she would do everything she could to help, and then she left. But in the days following the interview, the detectives worked with the phone company and retrieved all of Corey's recent phone records, and despite what Tiffany had said, there was no record of her calling Corey at 2:15 a.m. or any time after they supposedly left the club. And so after finding that out, Kingston and Carlisle wanted to speak to Tiffany again right away. But when they called Tiffany, they discovered she had left town, and soon after that, they were told by the lawyer she'd just hired that Tiffany would no longer help with their investigation. Detectives Kingston and Carlisle spent the next few weeks pursuing any lead that might provide more information on the obsessed dishwasher Eric or on Corey's friend Tiffany. And they had conversations with a lot of different people that made both of their suspects seem totally viable. But the detectives still did not have any concrete evidence linking either suspect to the crime scene or to Corey's murder. Then, Kingston and Carlisle finally got the test results back that they had been waiting for from the crime lab. And these tests showed that DNA from the hair found on Corey's underwear and from the blood on the kitchen counter and the outside kitchen windowsill belonged to the same person. And that person was not Corey. But the DNA did not match any samples the crime lab had on file or any samples that had been entered into the FBI's national DNA database. So this meant the police had proof that another person had been in Corey's apartment on the night she was killed, but they had no idea who that person was. Still, Kingston and Carlisle thought they were getting close to finding the killer, and after several more interviews, they believed they had zeroed in on one particular suspect and that they had enough proof to arrest someone. However, the district attorney did not agree. He told them that without proof of who the DNA found in the house belonged to, or some other smoking gun, this case would never hold up in court. This news from the district attorney felt like a gut punch to Kingston and Carlisle. And no matter who they talked to or what information they got, they could not find the type of evidence that would enable them to make an arrest. And so the investigation started to slow down, and Kingston and Carlisle started to run out of options. The case remained open, but it was no longer the department's top priority, and Kingston and Carlisle had to focus on other work. In late May of 2000, about 18 months after Corey's murder, a man named William Rensler sat on the dock of a lake near Jacksonville Beach, fishing with two of his friends. Rensler referred to himself as a fugitive specialist, but most people called him a bounty hunter. Rensler had tracked down criminals and bail jumpers, and he was skilled at finding people who had seemingly disappeared. Recently, Jacksonville Beach Police had put up a reward of $20,000 for anyone who could provide information that would lead to an arrest in Corey's murder. And once Rensler started looking into the past investigation, he became confident he could close the case, bring Corey's family some peace, and collect the reward money. Rensler laid his fishing rod down on the dock. He grabbed a beer from a cooler sitting next to him, he cracked it open, and then pulled out a thick file folder from his leather bag. He sipped from his beer and started looking over his notes on Corey's murder. Rensler's two friends, like everybody in town, knew about the case. They took a seat next to Rensler on the dock, they each grabbed a beer too, and asked him how it was going. Was he close to finding the killer? Rensler said he had interviewed a bunch of people connected to the case, but there was one person he really wanted to talk to that he just couldn't find. He pointed to this person's name in his notes, and both of his friends almost spit out their drinks. Rensler asked what was going on, and his friends said they both knew the person he was looking for because they had worked with them at a restaurant, and they told Rensler there was something really weird about this person. Rensler's friends said this person had come into the restaurant one day and said they had to quit and leave town immediately because their child had tragically died in Texas. Rensler asked, what was so weird about that? That sounded horrible. But one of his friends said he had gotten to know this person pretty well, and he was almost positive that they did not have children. Rensler took a swig of his beer and then asked his friends if they remembered when all this happened. And one of them said, this person he was looking for had left town around Thanksgiving about 1.5 years ago, not long after Corey Parker's murder. It would take a couple of months, but Rensler, the fugitive specialist, tracked down this person who had skipped town soon after Corey's murder. Rensler had traced their movements to Texas and then eventually discovered they had moved to a town in Maryland about 800 miles away from Jacksonville Beach. Once Rensler had this information, he informed detectives Kingston and Carlisle where this possible suspect was now living, and the detectives caught the next flight to Maryland to try to secure a DNA sample. On July 26, 2000, so 20 months after Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat in an unmarked car in Easton, Maryland, with a local police officer. The detectives were watching the suspect who was smoking a cigarette in a parking lot while on a break from work. And Kingston and Carlisle could not believe their luck. A discarded cigarette butt was perfect for getting a DNA sample, because the suspect's spit and saliva would be all over it. And so they watched their suspect smoke for several minutes, and when it looked like the cigarette was about to be out and they might flick it onto the ground, they felt a surge of adrenaline. But then, Kingston and Carlisle watched in horror as the suspect carefully put the cigarette out on the ground and then slipped the butt behind their ear. The detectives looked at each other. The suspect very likely knew they were being tailed by the police. The suspect turned to walk back into work, but before opening the door, they leaned down a little and spit on the ground. Kingston and Carlisle practically wanted to start cheering. They waited for the suspect to go inside, and then Carlisle got out of the car, ran across the parking lot, collected the spit off the ground, and ran back to the car. A little bit later, Kingston, Carlisle, and local police officers delivered that sample to the FBI's DNA lab, which is only about 70 miles from where they were. And when the FBI conducted their tests, they were able to match the DNA from the suspect's spit to the DNA samples taken from the hair and blood found in Corey's apartment. The fugitive specialist, the bounty hunter, William Rensler, had indeed led the detectives right to Corey's killer. Based on DNA testing, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Corey Parker in the early morning hours of November 28, 1998. At about 2 a.m., the killer crept towards Corey's apartment, trying their best to stay low and out of any lights that were shining from people's porches and balconies. The killer made their way around Corey's apartment to the kitchen window, and it was still open. So, quietly, the killer climbed in through the window and into the kitchen. The whole apartment was dark, but the killer knew their way around well enough. So they walked through the front room and down a short hallway to Corey's bedroom. They reached the bedroom door, and it was cracked open. The killer took a breath and opened the door just a little more and stepped into the bedroom. In the light coming through the window, the killer could see Corey sleeping in her bed, and they saw Corey's underwear laying near her leg on top of the comforter. The killer got excited and started breathing heavily. Then suddenly, Corey woke up. She heard someone breathing and saw a shadow near the foot of her bed. But before she could scream, the killer lunged at the bed and ripped the comforter off of Corey. The killer could see she was naked, and they leapt on top of her. The killer pinned Corey down, but Corey's arms were long and she was fast, and she fought back. The killer didn't see it, but in the struggle, their gold cigarette lighter tumbled out of their pocket and onto the floor. Corey slashed her hands and nails at the killer and cut into the palm of their hand and ripped at their hair. Then the killer grabbed Corey's head and slammed it against the headboard. With Corey suddenly stunned and woozy, the killer reached down and covered her mouth with one hand and reached around and grabbed the knife out of their pocket with the other. Then the killer raised the knife, and Corey put up her arms to try to defend herself, but the killer just cut at her arms, knocking them out of the way. Then the killer raised the knife again and stabbed Corey in the chest. The killer pulled the knife back up and stabbed her in the chest again and again, and Corey's body went limp and slumped against the headboard. But the killer did not stop. They kept stabbing as blood splashed onto the wall and ran down Corey's body onto the bed. Finally, the killer did stop, and they looked down at Corey. They had just stabbed her 101 times. The killer climbed off the bed and staggered back. They could barely think or see straight, but they made their way out of the bedroom and through the apartment. They walked into the kitchen, steadied themselves on the counter for a second, and then they climbed through the open window, leaving a little bit of blood on the windowsill. Once outside, the killer crouched back down and rushed through the darkness to the apartment building right behind Corey's. It would turn out the obsessed dishwasher, Eric, who had admitted to having fantasies about rape and murder, did not kill Corey. And neither did her close friend Tiffany, who police thought might have been infatuated with Corey. In fact, the killer was not somebody who police had suspected early on. It was a 17-year-old named Robert Denny, Corey's teenage neighbor who often hung out on his second-floor balcony in the apartment building right behind Corey's. Robert was not the peeping Tom who had been spotted in the area, but he did spend a lot of time spying on Corey. From his balcony, he could watch her in her apartment or when she went out to sit on her back porch. Police had talked to Robert when they talked to Corey's other neighbors, but he didn't seem to know her, and his age played in his favor. Police simply didn't believe that this crime had been carried out by a teenager. But when police later discovered that Robert had left town not long after the murder, they did start to reconsider their thoughts about him. And they even wanted to arrest him, but the district attorney did not believe they had enough evidence to make the case stick. When the fugitive expert, William Rensler, learned from his friends that Robert had given a really bizarre reason for leaving town so soon after Corey's murder, Rensler became convinced that Robert had killed Corey. Soon, Rensler tracked Robert down and told Detectives Kingston and Carlisle everything he had learned about the young man. And so, the detectives headed to Maryland and secured the DNA sample from Robert's spit that matched with the DNA samples found inside of Corey's apartment. In addition to those samples, one of Robert's ex-girlfriends came forward and told police that the gold cigarette lighter found in Corey's apartment belonged to Robert. And finally, detectives discovered that Robert's own brother was in a Texas prison for murdering a woman by stabbing her 98 times. And authorities came to believe that by stabbing Corey 101 times, Robert was just trying to outdo his brother. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he maintains his innocence. On Friday, August 21st, 2020, 58-year-old Aristides Polino was driving back to his home in Miami, Florida in his police SUV after completing a midnight shift. Aristides was a 25-year veteran of the Miami police force, and over the last 2+ decades, he had routinely done midnight shifts, so this was nothing new. When he got to his house, he parked his SUV in the driveway, and like always, he went right into his house. He didn't talk to his wife Clara or his son. He just went straight up to his bedroom and immediately fell asleep. About 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., Aristides woke up and he expected to hear his wife's voice somewhere in the house. So when he didn't, and the house was just totally silent, something told him that something was off. So he climbed out of bed, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs to look for his wife. When he got down to the living room, he saw his son sitting on the couch, but he didn't see his wife. And so he asked his son, hey, have you seen your mom? And he would say, no, I haven't seen her. But sensing on his dad's face that something was wrong, he said, hey, I'll help you look for mom. And so the two men began searching the house, yelling out for Clara, and Aristides began calling his wife, but she wasn't picking up. And after several minutes, the two men reconvened in the living room, and they started going over whether or not she had told them about some appointment that day, and that would explain why she wasn't in the house. But after talking about it, they decided that she didn't have any appointments, and she should be home right now. And so the men decided, maybe she went outside and she's talking to a neighbor, or, she went for a walk and she's talking to somebody on the road. And so they decided they would go outside and search the outside of the property. When they got outside, Aristides went towards the back of the property and his son went towards the front, down towards the driveway. And so as Aristides is making his way around the back of the property, he hears his son scream out for help. Aristides comes running back around the property and he sees his son standing in the driveway with the door of his police SUV wide open. 4 hours earlier, after Aristides came home, he parked his police SUV right in the driveway like he always did, and for some reason he left the car unlocked. And so he goes in the house and he falls asleep. And while he was sleeping, Clara, who was home, she exited the house and walked down the driveway to his SUV. She opened up the door and went inside. It's believed she was looking for something, although we don't know what she was looking for. And while she was in the back of his car fishing around for whatever it was she was looking for, the door she had entered the vehicle in shut behind her. And because this is a police SUV, the back seat was designated for suspects, and so the back two doors did not open from the inside. And there was a very thick partition separating the back seat from the front seat, so Clara could not just reach over the seats and honk the horn to get someone's attention. And Clara did not have her cell phone, so she couldn't call anyone for help. And when she screamed out for help to somebody out on the road to help her, her screams were severely muffled, and the back windows of this police car were heavily tinted, making it extremely difficult to see that there was a person in the back seat of this car. So for 4 hours, Clara desperately screamed and kicked and punched and did everything she could to try to free herself from the situation she was in. All the while, the temperature inside the car continued to go up. The SUV was parked in full sunlight, no shade whatsoever, and the temperatures that day were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so by the time Clara was ultimately discovered, the inside of that SUV had effectively become an oven. Aristides ran over to his vehicle and he pulled his wife out and he started doing CPR on her, but it was too late. She had died of heat stroke. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident.
Our next story is called Molding Room. It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was back-breaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak-making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold and it would get caked to the walls and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms. And he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar and he headed into this shut down molding room and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it, and then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt, and then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the kayak molding company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined 200,000 pounds.
Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined £25,000 and sentenced to jail for 9 months. The next and final story of today's episode is called Within Reach. On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going. Because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going headfirst into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go headfirst into a tunnel and you get stuck, What are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going headfirst into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way headfirst and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him, but then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so, Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in, and Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful, he's very relieved, he says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself, and so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time, but luckily Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked, and so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Homer began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there, and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him, and then all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above, and then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave. And periodically, rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you head